Okay, Kimmer here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about arithmetic operators, and I will go into depth with integer division because integer division is a little bit different in C and C-type languages. So let's get started. The very first thing we're going to take a look at are the operators that we can use to do pretty much any kind of mathematical problem. Notice we only have 5. We have addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and then there's the percent sign, which is known as the modulus, sometimes referred to as modulo or remainder. However you want to call it, I'm good with it, as long as we understand exactly how it works. In fact, let's take a look at the next thing. If I were to ask you, what is 9 divided by 4, what would you tell me the answer would be? For most people, especially non-programmers, they would tell you that it's 2.25. And if you asked any math teacher, that's probably exactly what your math teacher would tell you, 2.25. But what if I told you in computers, it's not 2.25? Instead, we kind of have to go back to elementary school, back when we used to do long division. Hopefully you still did that. I don't know. I know I did. So if we take 9 divided by 4, let's go ahead and do it the long way. So you have 4 goes into 9. How many times? Goes in 2. 4 times 2 is then 8. And do you remember? We go through and subtract 9 minus 8 to get 1. This is where it stops. When you have an integer, you don't have a decimal point, so you can't go any further than just this. So the answer to 9 divided by 4 is actually just 2. Because 4 can only go into 9 2 times. Period. That's it. No more. However, that brings us to the modulus operator. So the modulus operator, that percent sign, basically says, you know what? Let's go ahead and take the remainder. So when you do 9 mod 4, or 9 modulus 4, you don't get a 2. In this case, you'll just get the remainder, a 1. Do you remember having to do the little r for remainder when you did long division? Hopefully you did. So if we take a look at this, integer division works very differently. And we have lots of reasons for using integer division, and hopefully you'll see some of those soon. So one thing I want you to remember, an integer divided by an integer will only give you an integer. So we have to be very careful. Let's take a look at this next problem. What if I said to take 5 divided by 9 multiplied by 10? Have an idea what the answer might be? I'll give you a hint. How many times does 9 go into 5? If you said 0, that is correct. So a lot of students make this mistake early on. They'll put in a problem where they have integer division, and then they forget that, this might be 0, and then, of course, anything times 0 is going to be 0. So if you said the answer was 0, that is correct. Let's look at using modulus to determine even or odd. A lot of people like to use mod, and I think it's a very good method to do this. But I want you to understand why. Not just, hey, I'm just going to take some code here just because it works, but I don't understand why. So let's walk through it real quick. Let's say I take 4 divided by 2. Now, 4 is an even number, and we know that when we divide by 2, it goes in 2 times. Let's take 5 divided by 2. It also just goes in 2 times. No difference between an odd and an even here. Let's keep going. Let's take 6 divided by 2. Well, that's a 3. How about 7 divided by 2? Still a 3. 8 divided by 2? A 4. 9 divided by 2? A 4. So although we see a pattern, we don't have any way to distinguish an odd from an even. However, if we use the modulus or remainder of the exact same division problems that we just did, we'll start to see a pattern. So if we take 4 mod 2, meaning the remainder is 0. How about when we do 5? When we do 5 divided by 2, the remainder is 1. How about 6 divided by 2? A 0. How about 7 divided by 2? A 1. How about 8 divided by 2? 0. 9 divided by 2? 1. Now can you see a pattern? The 4, the 6, and the 8, all of which are even numbers, when you divide by 2, they give you a 0 as the remainder. If we take the 5, the 7, and the 9 divided by 2, notice we get a 1 as our remainder. Programming is just simply looking for patterns, and so we found a pattern here. We can turn that pattern into an equation. We can take any number and divide it by 2 and get its remainder, and that will be our answer. Then what we can do is look at that answer and say, okay, if it's a 1, we know that that particular number was odd. If it's a 0, we know that that number was even. Let's talk a little bit more about math. This is easy. Precedence rules were sometimes referred to as order of operations. Don't forget the very first thing that gets evaluated are anything in parentheses. And if there's multiple parentheses, you always evaluate from the inside out. Second thing you look for are multiplication, division, or modulus. Any one of those three that comes first, reading the equation from left to right. Last is addition and subtraction. Anything that comes first, left to right. So let's take a look at an example. What would be the answer to this equation? Basically, the hint is trying to figure out whether or not we're going to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, modulus first. So remember, always look for parentheses first, so the very first thing we're going to do is the 4 minus 3. So if we go ahead and do that, we get a 1. Perfect. Now what's the next thing we're going to do? 7 times 1, because we worked from left to right, so multiplication came before the division. Some people want to do that division first, so be very careful. 7 times 1 then would be 7. So working from left to right, still inside of our parentheses, we probably need to look at the division now. So we can do 7 divided by 2. Careful here. How many times does 2 go into 7? Hopefully you said 3. Integer divided by an integer is only going to give you an integer. Next, we have our parentheses to work through. So even though we do have a modulus, which comes before adding, we still have to focus on the parentheses. So 5 plus 3 plus 10, right? That will give us then 18. Then we do 18 mod 4. So just a little test. How many times does 4 go into 18? And then we really want to know what's the remainder. So we know that 4 goes into 18 how many times? What? 4 times? Because 4 times 4 is 16. But that gives us then a remainder of 2. So the answer is 2. Let's take a look at something else when it comes to math. How about assigning different data types? Let's say you have an integer variable called dollars and a float price variable that I have initialized to $12.45. Now, a couple things to note. I mentioned the word initialize, and I probably will again and again, but to initialize something basically means to give it a value at the time it's declared. That's it. I'm declaring a float called price, and I'm giving it a value at that same time, so therefore I'm initializing that value. Now, what if I want to take price and put it into dollars? Dollars will only contain the integer portion, so in other words, just the 12. Okay? You can't fit the decimal portion into an integer, so it gets lopped off. If it were 12.99, you would still only get 12. It does not round. It does something called truncate or cut. It cuts it at the 12, fits it into your integer, and calls it a day. Okay, so hopefully you learned a little bit about arithmetic operators, mostly the modulus, and understanding how your integers will be cut off if you try to put a float into an int. All right, that's it. We'll talk soon.